When the guns finally fell silent, the city did not understand that the war had ended. The sound of shells had been replaced by an even deeper silence, one that carried the weight of absence. Buildings stood as hollow silhouettes, their facades torn open, revealing the bones of a place that once breathed. Smoke drifted through empty streets, mixing with the dust of collapsed walls. The smell of burnt wood, wet plaster, and oil clung to the cold November air. Windows were gone, doors torn from their hinges, and electric wires hung loose like veins that no longer carried life. The war had not just taken lives. It had drained the city of its pulse. Electricity had disappeared weeks before. Substations lay in ruins. Power lines snapped and twisted across the cobblestones. Without power, the city was blind. The nights were endless, broken only by the faint glimmer of fires burning in tin cans and the occasional flash of distant explosions beyond the horizon. People learned to move by memory, tracing paths they could no longer see. They lived in the basements of shattered houses, where the air was thick with smoke and fear. Every night they waited, not for bombs or soldiers this time, but for a sign that life could still return. After the front line passed, the city remained trapped between war and peace. Soldiers marched on toward the next objective, leaving behind a place that was technically liberated but practically lifeless. In the daylight, one could see the scars more clearly. Tram tracks buried under rubble, poles bent and blackened, a cathedral roof torn open to the sky. Even the clocks had stopped, their hands frozen at the hour the power died. That November of 1944 was colder than usual. The wind came through the gaps in the ruins, carrying the echo of artillery long gone. The survivors wrapped themselves in whatever cloth they could find, huddling together in cellars and makeshift shelters. Every sound in the darkness felt amplified: the creak of a broken beam, the drip of water, the faint hum of something imagined. The city existed, but only as a shadow of itself. Then one night, a new sound broke the stillness. It was not the thunder of tanks or the crack of rifles, but the steady rumble of engines, trucks approaching from the western road. Their headlights cut through the fog, illuminating shattered walls and twisted steel. On their sides were painted white stars, marks of the Allied armies that had crossed into enemy territory. When the engine stopped, the silence returned, heavy and expectant. The men who stepped out wore uniforms, but they carried no rifles. Their hands held spools of cable, lanterns, and metal tools. They were engineers, soldiers of reconstruction. They moved quietly, studying the map of a city that had forgotten its own shape. They sought the remains of a substation, a place where the electric arteries could be rejoined, even for a single night. In the distance, faint figures watched from the ruins, civilians who no longer believed in miracles, only in survival. The engineers did not speak to them. They unpacked their generators, their tools, and their lengths of wire, working with the focus of men who had come to fight a different kind of battle. That night, the front line of war shifted from trenches to transformers, from bullets to voltage. The city's survival depended not on soldiers who could take it, but on those who could bring it back to life. It was the night when engineers became the keepers of hope, and when, for the first time since the bombs had fallen, the darkness trembled, not from fire, but from the promise of light. Historically, such scenes took place in multiple cities across Europe in the final years of the Second World War. In the winter of 1944, after the battles for Caen, Antwerp, and Aachen, Allied engineering units indeed entered devastated urban areas to restore basic power for hospitals, water pumps, and command posts. Their convoys carried portable generators, salvage cables, and searchlights, marking the beginning of Europe's long return from darkness. After the liberation of Western Europe in 1944, the cities that had been freed from occupation were left in a state that was barely livable. The fighting had stopped, but survival had not become easier. Allied troops marched onward, while behind them remained towns that were no longer under enemy control, yet could not sustain life. The retreating German army had destroyed bridges, power stations, and water systems to slow the advance. Air raids had already flattened much of the rest. In places like Caen, Antwerp, Aachen, and Cologne, the landscape resembled not civilization, but the skeleton of one. Infrastructure, the invisible framework of daily existence, had collapsed entirely. Water could not be pumped because the electric grid was gone. Hospitals that had survived the bombing stood silent and cold, their operating theaters dark, their instruments useless without current. In some towns, surgeons were forced to operate by candlelight or daylight that filtered weakly through shattered windows. Food warehouses lacked refrigeration. Bakeries could not fire their ovens, and trains stood idle on twisted rails. The war had not only taken lives, it had erased the ordinary rhythms that defined what it meant to live. In Caen, more than 70% of buildings were destroyed by the summer fighting, and the electrical system lay in pieces. In Antwerp, the harbor that was so crucial to Allied logistics could not function until engineers rebuilt power for cranes, pumps, and docks. In Aachen, the first major German city captured by Allied forces, the entire municipal grid was unusable. Power poles lay across the streets. The main substation had been shelled into rubble, and what little fuel remained was frozen in tanks or reserved for the army. In Cologne, whole neighborhoods were flattened, and the few surviving generators were seized to power military communication posts. For civilians, darkness was not just a condition, but a constant threat. Nights stretched endlessly, especially as winter deepened. Without electricity, there was no heat, no light, and no sense of security. Families gathered around small fires made from furniture, doors, and the wood of broken carts. They filled tin cans with oil or animal fat to create makeshift lamps. The weak flames cast trembling shadows on the walls, and the smell of burning paint and resin filled the air. Every light came to cost of something lost: a chair, a shelf, a piece of the past. The cold added another layer of misery. The winter of 1944 to 1945, one of the harshest in Europe's 20th century, made the absence of power fatal for thousands. In the ruins of Aachen and Cologne, cases of frostbite and pneumonia spread rapidly. Water pumps froze, pipes burst, and streets turned into sheets of ice. Without electricity, even communication faltered. Telephones were dead, radios silent, and the nights were pierced only by the sound of wind moving through the empty shells of buildings. The destruction also paralyzed recovery. Clearing rubble required machinery, but machines needed fuel and power. Restoring water systems depended on electric pumps that no longer functioned. Hospitals and relief stations could not sterilize instruments or heat wards. Aid convoys arrived, but supplies often rotted in dark warehouses because refrigeration was impossible. In many liberated zones, soldiers themselves had to act as electricians, plumbers, and mechanics simply to make their camps livable. For the people who remained, the absence of light carried a symbolic weight that went beyond survival. Darkness was a reminder that the war had stripped them not only of comfort, but of order. A city without light was a city without direction. The blacked-out streets, once alive with street lamps and shop windows, became endless corridors of uncertainty. To move through them at night was to wander through history's blind spot, where the line between war and peace disappeared. The armies that had liberated Europe soon discovered that victory meant more than taking ground. It meant rebuilding what could allow life to return. Without water, heat, or power, freedom was fragile. Every night that the city stayed dark, the sense of deliverance dimmed. The soldiers who fought to reclaim these places saw that the battle was not finished. It had merely changed its form. The next campaign would be fought not with artillery, but with cables, transformers, and generators. What the guns had destroyed, the engineers now had to revive. Historically, this reality was recorded across the Western Front in late 1944. After the battles for Caen, Antwerp, Aachen, and Cologne, Allied military engineers were tasked with restoring electricity and water supplies under freezing conditions. They salvaged cables from wrecked tanks, repaired substations with scrap metal, and power hospitals and command posts with mobile diesel units. In the darkness of post-liberation Europe, light itself became the rarest and most precious resource, the one that signaled not only survival, but the first fragile return of peace. In the closing years of the Second World War, the work of military engineers became as vital as that of soldiers on the front. As Allied forces advanced through Western Europe in 1944, each liberated city was left crippled by destruction. Power stations, bridges, and water systems had been prime targets for bombing and sabotage. What remained of the electrical infrastructure was either ruined by combat or dismantled by retreating German units to slow the Allied push. To make these shattered places livable again, the Allies created specialized engineering groups whose mission went beyond combat, to restore what they called minimum essential services. The phrase came from field manuals issued to the Royal Engineers and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It described the immediate post-liberation goal, not rebuilding cities permanently, but reviving them just enough to function. The tasks were immense. Roads had to be cleared, bridges repaired, and water pumped before civilians could return. Yet nothing could be achieved without electricity. Power was needed to operate pumps, hospitals, radio stations, depots, and docks. Without it, every other service remained paralyzed. In Normandy, after the Battle for Caen in the summer of 1944, British engineer electricians began one of the first large-scale restoration efforts. Nearly three-quarters of the city had been flattened by the Allied bombardment, but engineers salvaged the surviving turbines of a local power station and repaired damaged switchgear. They improvised on materials recovered from wrecked ships and military vehicles, using steel cables from landing craft and transformers from naval depots. By September, they had managed to light sections of the harbor and supply power to water pumps and dockyards, marking one of the earliest cases of electrical recovery during the campaign in France. Further north, in Antwerp, the challenge was even greater. The city's capture in early September gave the Allies a vital deep water port, but its harbor could not function without electricity. German demolition squads had disabled cranes and flooded the dry docks, leaving the facility useless. British and Canadian engineers, working with local technicians, installed portable generators on rail platforms and dock vessels to create temporary power plants. From these improvised units, they extended a network of cables feeding the harbor's essential machinery. This system not only reopened a port, but also provided emergency energy to parts of the city and neighboring Belgian towns. The success of Antwerp's re-electrification became a model for later operations across the Low Countries. In the Netherlands, similar efforts followed. As Allied troops advanced after Operation Market Garden, the Royal Engineers electrical units and U.S. Army engineers laid over 20 miles of temporary transmission lines to connect liberated zones to functioning substations behind the front. They repaired poles using salvaged timber and restored small hydroelectric plants where possible. Even when the supply was weak and unstable, these temporary networks allowed hospitals and bakeries to operate again. On the German frontier, the battle for Aachen in October 1944 showed how essential such work had become. The city had been heavily bombed, its power stations reduced to rubble. When the fighting ended, the U.S. 1059th Engineer Port Construction and Repair Group, along with detachments of the 1057th Engineer Utilities Detachment, moved in to assess the damage. They restored basic lighting and power to military command centers and hospitals using mobile diesel units. Every kilowatt mattered. It meant running a water pump, lighting an operating room, or transmitting orders through radio. By early 1945, the scale of these operations had expanded across Western Europe. The U.S. Army's Advanced Section, Communications Zone ADSEC, reported that in the Rhineland and Ruhr areas alone, over 150 miles of transmission lines were rebuilt under combat conditions. Power from substations near Liège and later from Cologne was rerouted to nearby towns, mines, and rail junctions to support both civilian recovery and military logistics. Portable generators, mostly diesel units adapted from tanks, trucks, and ships, became the backbone of these emergency grids. For the engineers, the work was relentless. They labored in freezing weather, often under sniper fire or in mined areas, using whatever materials could be salvaged. Many were electricians, mechanics, and linemen in civilian life who now found themselves rebuilding Europe by torchlight. Their networks were fragile, easily damaged, and never meant to last. Yet for the people who lived among the ruins, the sudden return of light was more than a technical achievement. It was proof that the war's tide had turned, that even amid rubble, order could begin to reappear. Historically, these restoration efforts laid the foundation for Europe's post-war reconstruction. The Allied engineers' emergency systems were later replaced by permanent grids under the supervision of local utilities and the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration UNRWA. But the first sparks of recovery, the temporary lines stretched through bombed cities, the generators humming on rail cars, the single bulb glowing in a dark hospital, All began with those wartime missions of minimum essential services. In the winter of 1944 to 1945, light returned not as a symbol of victory, but as a first fragile sign that civilization itself had survived. When Allied troops entered Aachen in October 1944, they crossed not only a front line, but a historical threshold. It was the first major German city to fall into Allied hands, and what they found inside was a place stripped of identity. Months of bombing and 2 weeks of street fighting had turned Aachen into a graveyard of stone and steel. Entire districts were flattened. The cathedral stood surrounded by craters, and smoke still rose from the old town. The city's infrastructure, once one of the most modern in Western Germany, had been annihilated. Power stations were destroyed, the tram network was shredded, and the municipal water supply was barely functioning. The few remaining civilians, around 5,000 from a pre-war population of 160,000, lived in basements, surviving on melted snow and the contents of Red Cross rations. The liberation of Aachen presented a problem that was new to the Allied command. It was no longer just about capturing ground, but about proving that a city could live again once freed. The military occupation alone could not restore order. Communication lines were dead, hospitals were dark, and the lack of electricity threatened both soldiers and civilians alike. Without power, there was no way to pump water, operate field hospitals, or light command centers for nighttime defense. The absence of light meant vulnerability, both tactical and human. Within days of the fighting's end, the U.S. Ninth Army requested engineering support from the 1059th Engineer Port Construction and repair group and elements of the 1057th Engineer Utilities Detachment. These units were not combat troops, but technical specialists trained to rebuild vital systems under fire. Their task in Aachen was simple in theory yet immense in practice: to bring the city back to operational life. They arrived with convoys of diesel generators, mobile floodlights, spools of cable, and salvage tools gathered from depots in Liège and Namur. The first priority was light. The engineers set up temporary generator units in the courtyard of a damaged factory on the outskirts of the city. Using fuel drawn from abandoned German vehicles, they established a circuit that powered floodlights around key intersections and military command posts. For the first time in weeks, beams of electric light pierced the darkness. These lights were not for comfort. They were for survival. They allowed patrols to move safely through the ruins, for supply trucks to unload food and medicine at night, and for medical units to operate after sundown. Their second objective was communication. The city's telephone exchange had been destroyed by artillery fire, so the engineers ran insulated lines between Allied headquarters, hospitals, and logistics centers. The wires were strung through window frames and across collapsed rooftops, often under sniper threat. Improvised radio masts powered by portable generators were installed near the Aachen Cathedral, enabling direct communication with the Ninth Army headquarters in Maastricht. As the engineers worked, they discovered that much of Aachen's pre-war electrical network was beyond repair. Transformers were shattered, insulators melted, and the main substation near the Lausberg Hill had been obliterated. The only solution was to bypass the city's original system entirely. They linked new circuits from military field generators and reconnected sections of intact cable to form a patchwork grid that could deliver limited voltage to hospitals, depots, and the local water station. By the third week after liberation, small miracles began to occur. A hospital ward lit up with a steady glow from the emergency lines. The pumping station at the edge of the city resumed operation, filling the reservoirs that had been dry since the summer. A few surviving streetlights flickered to life, creating islands of light amid the ruins. For the exhausted soldiers guarding the streets, and for civilians emerging cautiously from cellars, this illumination felt like the first tangible sign that the war was finally moving away from them. Historically, the restoration of Aachen's utilities marked the beginning of a new phase in the Allied campaign, the transition from conquest to reconstruction. The work done there by the American engineer units set a precedent for operations that would follow in Cologne, Dusseldorf, and across the Ruhr. It also demonstrated the strategic importance of engineering support in modern warfare. Without light, without water, without power, victory could not sustain itself. The men who brought generators instead of rifles became the bridge between destruction and recovery, proving that rebuilding could begin even before the war itself had ended. The engineers began their work in Aachen before the smoke had even cleared. They labored through the night beneath a faint orange glow, not from electric lamps, but from kerosene lanterns and the smoldering ruins that still burned in the distance. The air smelled of wet brick, diesel, and dust. Every step had to be deliberate. The streets were littered with live wires, jagged metal, and unexploded ordnance. Yet despite the danger, they moved methodically, setting up command points, unloading equipment, and sketching crude maps of the surviving infrastructure. What they attempted was less repair than resurrection. The first task was to locate any substation that could be salvaged. Teams of American engineers from the 1059th Port Construction and Repair Group surveyed the city grid using German maps recovered from the town hall archives. Most substations had been reduced to rubble, but one smaller installation on the outskirts still stood with steel shell intact. It became the nucleus of their efforts. The engineers pried open the doors, cleared debris, and removed burnt insulation from the control panels. From there, they began assembling a makeshift network of cables scavenged from every possible source: communication lines, damaged vehicles, and abandoned tram systems. They worked with minimal resources. There were no new transformers or proper insulators. Instead, they repurposed whatever they could find. Coils from radio sets were rewired into temporary fuses. Pieces of tank engines and aircraft generators were stripped for usable copper and steel. Mechanics converted spare Jeep axles into cable spools, winding hundreds of meters of salvage wire. Each improvised solution carried risk. Overloading a cable could cause it to burst into flame, and grounding faults were frequent in the wet autumn soil. But the alternative, darkness and silence, was worse. In the districts too dangerous or too damaged to reconnect the grid, the engineers deployed autonomous diesel generators. Many of these have been adapted from military vehicles, truck-mounted or shipborne units capable of providing limited but steady current. They were placed near hospitals, field kitchens, and water pumping stations. The low hum of the engines became the new heartbeat of the city, their rhythmic vibration echoing through empty streets. In several hospitals, medical staff used these generators to power surgical lamps and sterilizers, performing the first night operations since the siege began. Lighting roads and crossings presented another challenge. With power lines still down and no functioning street network, the city was dangerous to navigate after dusk. To assist the engineers, the British Moonlight batteries, artillery units equipped with high-powered searchlights positioned their projectors at the city's edge. By angling the beams upward toward low clouds, they created a diffuse, silvery glow that illuminated large areas without revealing precise targets to enemy artillery. Under this ghostly artificial moonlight, teams could continue repairing cables, digging trenches, and clearing debris long after dark. Their work demanded not only technical skill, but endurance. The nights were freezing, and the constant vibration of generators mixed with the howl of the wind. They slept in shifts inside trucks, wrapped in tarps stiff with frost. The tools froze to their hands, and the smallest spark of electricity brought both relief and fear. Proof that life was returning, but also that any misconnection could destroy what little they had built. When fuel ran low, they siphoned diesel from wrecked German vehicles and filtered it through rags. When cables ran out, they twisted telephone wire into extensions and hoped it would hold. By the third week, they had created a fragile but functioning network. Power flowed to a handful of critical points: the main field hospital, the water pumping station, the 9th Army Communications Post, and a few intersections used by supply convoys. The lights flickered and sometimes died, but each time the engineers restarted the generators, the city seemed to breathe again. For the first time since the bombing, a faint electrical hum joined the wind. It was the sound of a city slowly coming back to life. Historically, this process mirrored the real efforts of Allied engineer units across Western Europe in late 1944 and early 1945. In Aachen, Cologne, and Antwerp, U.S. and British engineers established emergency power systems using portable generators and improvised wiring, often under combat conditions. The Moonlight batteries of the Royal Artillery indeed provided artificial illumination for night operations, first tested in Italy and later used in northwest Europe during the final campaigns. These improvised electrical systems, though temporary, became crucial lifelines, powering hospitals, water pumps, and field headquarters at a moment when cities balanced on the thin edge between survival and ruin. By the time dawn crept over the shattered skyline of Aachen, the engineers' work had begun to bear fruit. After nights of exhaustion, of frostbitten fingers and sputtering generators, the first week current ran to the cables they had laid. It was inconsistent, fragile, and often cut off without warning, but was electricity, something the city had not known in months. The voltage meters flickered to life, their needles trembling as if testing the air. A faint hum rolled to the remaining wires, followed by the hesitant flicker of light bulbs in a few surviving buildings. What had been a silent city now gave its first mechanical sigh. In one of the military field hospitals set up in a partially intact schoolhouse, the operating lamps glowed for the first time since the siege. The medical staff, who had spent weeks working by candlelight and oil burners, paused to watch as white light filled the room. The hum of the generator outside was steady, a rhythm that seemed almost alive. For the surgeons performing emergency procedures on wounded soldiers and civilians, this light meant precision, speed, and hope. It meant fewer deaths simply because of darkness. In the days that followed, similar small miracles occurred across the city. Sterilizers powered up, refrigeration units started running again, and wounded men who had been shivering in unheated wards were finally kept warm. At the railway depot, pumps that had been frozen and motionless began to move again. Engineers had managed to connect the depot's old electric motors to the temporary grid, allowing them to fill water tanks for steam locomotives and supply trucks. The gurgling sound of water rushing through pipes, something so ordinary before the war, became an almost sacred noise to those who heard it. With the pumps running, sanitation improved, and the risk of disease among both civilians and troops decreased. The return of power also allowed communication lines to stabilize. Radio transmitters that had been silent for weeks sent their first clear messages across the border to Allied command centers. For the people of Aachen, the transformation was slow, but deeply felt. The civilians who had survived in basements for months began to venture out cautiously. From the ruins, they saw faint patches of yellow light in the distance. The glow of hospital windows, the floodlights near Supply Depot, a single working street lamp flickering at the end of a road. These lights became landmarks in a landscape of ruin, guiding those who were displaced, lost, or searching for loved ones. The steady drone of diesel engines echoed through the night, a constant mechanical lullaby that replaced the sound of artillery. To the engineers, it was proof that their machines were alive. To the civilians, it was proof that civilization itself had not completely vanished. The presence of light changed more than the city's appearance. It altered its spirit. The first nights with restored electricity carried a strange sense of peace. Soldiers on patrol could navigate without lanterns, their paths marked by the pale glow reflecting off wet cobblestones. Relief trucks could unload supplies through the night, and medical convoys found their way along illuminated intersections. The city was still broken, still under threat from air raids and shortages, but it no longer felt abandoned. The engineers themselves witnessed this transformation with a quiet sense of purpose. Many of them were electricians, mechanics, and linemen in civilian life, and they understood what this light meant. They took shifts maintaining the generators, refueling them every few hours, and adjusting the wiring when overloaded circuits tripped. When a hospital lost power, they worked through the night to restore it, often in freezing rain or under the threat of sniper fire from nearby hills. Their success was measured not in miles of cable, but in human reactions. A nurse's relief when her instruments worked again, a soldier's sigh as a heater flickered on, a child's face lit by a lamp for the first time in months. Historically, accounts from American and British engineering units confirmed these scenes. In Aachen, Cologne, and Antwerp, temporary power restored by Allied engineers in late 1944 allowed critical services, hospitals, depots, and communication centers to resume within days of liberation. Field reports from a U.S. Ninth Army's engineer detachments note that mobile generators provided continuous power for up to 48 hours before refueling, and their operation was considered vital to both military logistics and civilian survival. In some cases, local German technicians cooperated with the Allies, offering maps and guidance to reconnect water and electrical systems. These small-scale restorations did not bring full normalcy, but they did something perhaps more important. They reminded people that life, in some form, was still possible. In the ruins of Aachen, as the sky turned gray and the wind carried the smell of diesel over the rubble, the flickering light from a hospital window stood as a quiet declaration that the city and its people had endured. The success of Aachen's restoration did not remain isolated. What began as a desperate attempt to bring one city back to life soon became a model for Allied reconstruction efforts across liberated Europe. From the beaches of Normandy to the bombed industrial heartland of Germany, the quiet work of engineers formed an invisible network of recovery that stretched across the continent. Every army division had its own engineering units, but as the front advanced, the scale of the task grew so vast that entire corps were reorganized around one essential mission: to restore power, water, and transport wherever the battle line moved. In France, the earliest and most extensive efforts took place in Normandy. After the capture of Cherbourg in the summer of 1944, British and American engineer electricians worked alongside French utility workers to rebuild local grids. In Caen, engineers repaired over 30 miles of cable within weeks, reviving docks, hospitals, and water plants. In Cherbourg, power was restored to the port using generators taken from naval ships, which allowed unloading of cargo for the Allied advance. These operations were recorded by the Royal Engineers as part of the Rehabilitation of Civil Services program, the first large-scale example of coordinated military-civilian reconstruction under active combat conditions. In Belgium, similar work unfolded after the liberation of Antwerp in September 1944. The port, crucial to Allied logistics, was a lifeless expanse of cranes, ships, and flooded basins. Before supplies could flow, engineers had to bring the harbor back to electrical life. British, Canadian, and Belgian teams installed temporary generators on barges and rail cars, linking them through miles of new wiring to the docks and warehouses. When power finally surged through the lines, the cranes began to move again, and for the first time since the German occupation, the city's harbor lights shone across the Scheldt. That light symbolized not just a port reopened, but a continent reconnecting with itself. In the Netherlands, the pattern repeated as Allied troops advanced through the lowlands. Towns like Nijmegen, Eindhoven, and Tilburg had suffered heavy bombardment, and engineers were often forced to improvise new networks from scratch. Portable substations were set up using transformers salvaged from destroyed German installations. The Royal Engineers electrical units laid more than 20 miles of temporary transmission lines from Antwerp to the southern Dutch provinces. Though the power supply remained unstable, it was enough to operate bakeries, hospitals, and communication centers. In liberated regions north of the Maas, engineers even adapted small windmills and hydro plants to feed power into the temporary grid, a rare but inventive example of local ingenuity meeting military necessity. Further south, in Italy, the pattern had already been established during the earlier campaigns of 1943 to 44. Allied engineers there had faced the same problems: destroyed bridges, ruined stations, and cities plunged into darkness. In Bologna, after months of German occupation and Allied bombing, hospitals and relief centers were powered by mobile generators brought in by the U.S. Fifth Army Engineers. Reports from the time describe engineers working inside monasteries and schools converted into medical centers, using salvaged German equipment to keep the generators running. These experiences provided the blueprint for later operations in Northern Europe. By early 1945, as Allied armies reached the Rhine, engineering battalions operated almost as autonomous reconstruction forces. In the Cologne region in the Ruhr Valley, the most industrialized part of Germany, American engineers undertook the enormous task of reactivating the 110 kilovolt transmission lines that once powered the coal mines and steel plants. These high-voltage lines were essential not only for civilian survival, but also for the continuation of Allied supply routes and communication networks. The U.S. Army's Advanced Section Communications Zone ADSEC reported that more than 150 miles of transmission lines had been rebuilt by March 1945, connecting restored substations around Liège, Aachen, and Cologne. Power from these networks kept mines operational, fueled water systems, and supported hospitals and relief centers. Even in the chaos of war, these efforts displayed an unprecedented level of coordination between armies, engineers, and local technicians. In many cities, captured German engineers were put to work under Allied supervision, providing invaluable knowledge of local grids. French and Belgian civilians volunteered to assist, digging trenches for cables and helping maintain generators. Each successful restoration created a ripple effect. One working substation meant that nearby towns could be powered, that railways could operate again, and that reconstruction could accelerate. The engineers' impact was rarely captured in newsreels or war reports, yet their contribution was foundational. They operated in silence, often behind the lines, surrounded by debris rather than glory. But every working lamp, every pump that delivered clean water, every factory that could resume production became a victory as real as any battle. The phrase "invisible front," coined by Allied press correspondents, was more than metaphor. Without the engineers' steady work, the liberation of Europe would have stalled in darkness. Historically, the record of these operations appears in the reports of the Royal Engineers, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and ADSEC, whose archives document the restoration of hundreds of miles of electrical and communication infrastructure between 1944 and 1945. From Normandy to the Ruhr, their projects connected liberated cities into a fragile but functioning network, the first outline of post-war Europe's recovery. The light they brought was temporary, but it carried forward the one truth that would define the rebuilding of a continent. Freedom was not only to be won, but powered. When the war finally ended in 1945, the men who had built power lines through battlefields and raised lights over ruins packed up their equipment and went home. Their task had been completed. Though few noticed its full meaning at the time, the world celebrated the generals, the victories, and the armistice. Yet the engineers who had rebuilt cities amid the smoke and rubble returned quietly to civilian life. Many of them had been electricians, mechanics, and builders before the war, and they slipped back into those professions with little recognition. But the legacy of their work lingered in every city that had once been dark. In the first years after the war, Europe's reconstruction relied heavily on the experience of those same men. Under the Marshall Plan, both American and British engineers who had served in the European theater were recruited to advise and assist with rebuilding efforts. They supervised the construction of power stations, hydroelectric dams, and urban grids that would define post-war modernity. Some of the earliest projects in the Ruhr and Rhineland industrial zones drew directly from wartime improvisations. The same temporary circuits that had been thrown together from scavenged cable now inspired permanent infrastructure plans. The engineers had learned how to design systems resilient to damage, flexible enough to be restored quickly if ever struck again. Across Western Europe, the foundations they had laid in emergency became the starting points of post-war renewal. In France and Belgium, the temporary power lines installed by Allied units were absorbed into the revived national grids of Électricité de France and Electrabel. In the Netherlands, the engineers who had once restored power under fire became part of the government's massive post-liberation reconstruction program, which by 1950 had fully reconnected the war-torn southern provinces. Italy, too, benefited from the wartime experience of Allied and local technicians. Cities like Bologna and Florence modernized their energy systems in direct continuation of the emergency networks established in 1944. For the United States and Britain, the experience transformed military engineering itself. Reports compiled by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Royal Engineers after 1945 emphasize how restoring minimum essential services had become a decisive factor in maintaining control of liberated areas. This concept evolved into modern doctrines of civil-military cooperation, shaping post-war operations in Korea, the Balkans, and beyond. The idea that victory required not only destruction of enemy forces, but also immediate restoration of life-supporting infrastructure became a cornerstone of 20th century humanitarian and peacekeeping missions. Yet for those who had lived through it, the memory of the work remained personal. Many engineers kept no records, though their photographs survived, black and white images, showing a group of men standing beside a portable generator in a sea of rubble, or a searchlight piercing the night over a ruined street. In these photographs, the light itself seemed to be the only living element. For the survivors of cities like Aachen, Cologne, Cannes, and Antwerp, those beams of light symbolized not merely power but presence, the proof that someone had stayed behind to make life possible again. Local archives and museums across Europe still preserve evidence of these operations. Field reports, hand-drawn maps of temporary electrical grids, and correspondence between Allied and civilian engineers. In Aachen City archives, there are documents detailing the U.S. Army's work in restoring the municipal water and power systems in the winter of 1944-45. In Antwerp and Cannes, photographs show the reopening of hospitals and docks under the glow of improvised lights. These traces are modest but powerful, reminders that the rebuilding of Europe began not with ceremonies but with the turning of switches in cold, dark rooms. The legacy of these engineers was both material and moral. Material, because their emergency networks became the backbone for the continent's reconstruction. Moral, because their actions embodied a different kind of victory, one not measured in ground gain but in lives sustained. The quiet professionalism that guided them through bombed-out streets continued to shape the ethos of post-war reconstruction. Precision, patience, and compassion disguised as technical work. Decades later, when historians look back on the liberation of Europe, they began to recognize this invisible front as one of the unsung achievements of the Allied campaign. The engineers had proven that progress could emerge even from devastation, and that technology, when guided by humanity, could restore more than just power. It could restore faith. For every ruined city that flickered back to life in those final months of the war, their work had lit not only the streets, but the future. This story was never truly about wires, transformers, or diesel engines. It was about the people who, in the midst of ruin, chose to create instead of destroy. Their tools were simple, their surroundings hostile, but their purpose transcended the battlefield. In a world still trembling from the noise of war, they brought something that could not be commanded by any general: light. What they restored was not only electricity, but the fragile thread of civilization itself. In those cold months of 1944 and 1945, the engineers who labored through rubble were not merely repairing machines. They were repairing meaning. Every line they reconnected, every generator they coaxed into life, became a quiet act of defiance against the chaos that had consumed Europe. The war had taught men how to obliterate entire cities in minutes. Now, these same men had to relearn what it meant to rebuild them, brick by brick, circuit by circuit. Their work was the opposite of conquest. It was restoration. And in the glow of a single electric bulb flickering over a ruined street, one could see something greater than victory: the return of human order to a world that had forgotten it. For those who witnessed it, the first return of light was unforgettable. Survivors of bombing raids, soldiers hardened by years of fighting, and children who had never known a night, without fear, all watched as the darkness gave way to a faint but steady glow. That glow meant more than warmth or safety. It meant that humanity, after being buried beneath years of destruction, could still rise. Light became the symbol of moral resistance, a fragile, trembling force that nevertheless cut through the void. It proved that war could not extinguish the instinct to build, to repair, to protect life rather than take it. Historically, the return of power to cities like Aachen, Antwerp, and Cologne was a practical achievement, but its emotional and philosophical weight went far deeper. The Allied engineers' work embodied a principle that would guide post-war Europe. That recovery begins not with declarations or borders, but with compassion expressed through action. Each illuminated hospital, each powered water pump, was a statement that civilization endures when people choose service over dominance, cooperation over violence. In the faint hum of the generators, one could almost hear the first heartbeat of peace. The men who brought light back into the ruins did not think of themselves as heroes. Most of them were simply doing their jobs. Electricians from Chicago, linemen from Manchester, machinists from Toronto, applying familiar skills in unfamiliar devastation. Yet history would show that their work carried a moral weight equal to that of the soldiers who fought. Where others tore down, they rebuilt. Where war erased faces and names, they restored a possibility of recognition. The chance to see one another again, not as enemies, but as human beings standing in the same light. When the first glow of electricity spread across the broken streets, it was more than a technical triumph. It was the first breath of a reborn world. The light did not erase the ruins, but it allowed people to see them clearly, to acknowledge the damage and to begin imagining what could grow in its place. The engineers' quiet persistence became a metaphor for the resilience of humanity itself. Even amid wreckage, they demonstrated that renewal was possible, that order could rise from chaos, and that mercy could exist even in the machinery of war. In the end, The light they restored was both literal and symbolic, a brief illumination of what humanity might still be. It did not last long. Generators failed. Cables broke. Cities needed years to heal. But in that fleeting brightness, the world glimpsed its own capacity for rebirth. The moment when the current returned, when lamps burned once more over the ruins of Europe, marked not just the end of war's darkness, but the beginning of peace. It was a moment when humankind, for the first time in years, remembered how to breathe again,